Okay, well, we'll get started. Thanks again, everyone, for our concluding speaker in our series. Dr. John Saltmarsh directs the New England Resource Center in higher education. He is a professor at UMass Boston in higher education leadership, and has been involved in nearly every national effort and consortium and association around civic engagement for some years now. And a lot of his work in this time of year, as we prepare for the applications of the Carnegie Classification, his center is really the administrative backbone for that work. So we are really pleased to have him here with us and to share with us sort of the big picture on not only this classification, but the critical importance of this work in higher education, where it's going, and where Cleveland State's opportunities are as we move forward in this important work. So with that, Dr. John Saltmarsh.
You should probably wait on the applause. Right? So thanks, Byron, and I just want to tell you too that I've been really excited about the conversations that I've had so far being on campus. It's actually wonderful to see the work that you're doing. But I also want to just say that you've got a terrific leader and resource with Byron White here. I've known Byron for years, and when he asked me to come out here and I saw the list of people who have been here, I was both humbled and impressed. You've had a great set of speakers, all friends and colleagues of mine. But I have to tell you too that when Byron asked me to come, my response was, I'll do anything for you, Byron. And I meant that seriously, because I get asked to do a lot of these things, and even trying to schedule this was not easy. But I feel really strongly, very strongly, about the kind of deep engagement work that Byron is doing and has been doing for years, and would, if he asked me to come anywhere, I would come and do what he asked me to do, because he's a terrific colleague, and you've got a great person here on campus. So in terms of the context of the other conversations that you've had, I think one way to think about it is you've talked with Laura Lee Sandman and Carrie Ann O'Mara around faculty work and the curriculum, and you've talked with Nick Longo about the student work and David Marassi about anchor institutions. I'm going to operate at a slightly different level, which is more maybe kind of the 30,000 foot level around the institution as a whole. And what does this mean for how the institution identifies itself, how it organizes itself, how it practices as an institution community engagement. So that's sort of the way that I'm going to approach this. And I also want this to be, as much as we can, a conversation. So I'm going to talk for a while, and then I'm going to leave it to you to do some talking, and then we can come back. It would help me too if we could just really do this quickly, just to kind of know who's in the room. So can we just go around and just do really quick introductions? Can we just start here? From chemistry? Great, thanks.
Dan Malthrop, Civic Commons.
Yep.
Jill Zyman, Civic Commons.
Okay. And this table?
Stephen Corey, History and Religious Studies.
Okay.
Lee Wilberscheid, Modern Languages and Teacher Education.
Okay.
Victor Nicole Gallagher, College of Business Management Department.
Victoria Wimbush, School of Social and Diversity Management.
Okay. Thanks.
Mamadou Seck, School of Social Work.
Adrian Goslin, Department of English.
Prester Pickett, Black Studies.
Ruthia Douglas, Community Relations at Cuyahoga.
Thanks for coming.
I'm Charlie Pratt, Cleveland Transfer Connection.
Okay.
Megan Horwitz, Cleveland Transfer Connection.
We're doing quick introductions.
Oh, George Segaris, social work.
Ashley Chapin, Dr. White's GA.
Minnie Jones, Urban Studies.
Norm Blatt, Civil and Environmental Engineering.
Jessica Columbia.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So I want to start with a question. And then we'll come back to this question, and I want you to think about it and talk about it. But what would it take for Cleveland State University to achieve national prominence as an engaged university? What would that mean? And I want to start with the Carnegie Classification. As Byron told you, the center that I direct is involved with this classification in the sense that we serve as the administrative partner for the Carnegie Foundation in implementing the classification. And the classification is defined in very specific ways. If you look at the first paragraph here, the emphasis is really on engagement as a process of collaboration and reciprocity. In other words, it's a two-way interchange between the academy and those outside the academy. It's a process, right, which in that process is this deep notion of collaboration and reciprocity. Right? And then the second part is around purpose. Right? So why do we do this collaboration and reciprocity? Why even do this kind of engagement work? And it comes back to the mission of our institutions, the purposes of higher education in preparing citizens for a democracy. Right? So there's a core reason for why we do this work. Right? And the Carnegie Classification is an attempt to try to provide campuses with a way to claim this kind of community engagement work with this kind of purpose as part of who they are as an institution. Okay. Just some quick background. The classification was started by the Carnegie Foundation in 2005. It was piloted, and then the first classification was 2006, and then there was one in 2008 and 2010. And now it's in the same 5-year cycle as the basic classification. The basic classification we all have on our campuses. It's put together out of data which we submit for other purposes. Carnegie then uses that data to classify us. So we can be classified as a community college, right? There are actually 6 different classifications for community college, depending on size, and rural, urban, right? So there's all sorts of, it's not like one classification. Liberal arts colleges, master's granting institutions, doctoral granting institutions, research institutions, right? So that we all have these classifications of who we are. Cleveland State University tends to be, it is in a basic classification, it's referred to as a research high university. Right? There are 3 research classifications, so it's in the middle of that classification. Classifications, not because the Carnegie Foundation wants it that way, but they tend to be used for ranking purposes. Right? So you will probably still hear people talk about, well, you know, we're a Research 1 university. There's actually no such thing as a Research 1 university anymore because Carnegie got rid of that classification 2 cycles ago. But people still talk about it that way because it's kind of prestigious to say we're a Research 1. Right? So it gets used for ranking purposes. That's not what it was ever intended for. It was intended as a way to understand higher education institutions and for research purposes. So campuses have their basic classification, and then if they choose to, they can have a community engagement classification. The purpose of this was to open the possibility for campuses to claim a different kind of identity. So Cleveland State can be very much, and is a research high institution, but it could also be a community engaged institution and claim that through the classification scheme. And when this was designed, it was designed so that it would capture engagement at all different kinds of institutions. And in fact, that's what's happened. There are 311 campuses that have the classification across all institutional types, and engagement looks very different at different kinds of institutions. Another way to think about the classification is this way. This is a piece that Gary Rhodes did, actually just after he became General Secretary of the AAUP. But it's a really good way, I think, to think about what this classification is all about. And if we think about really a century or more of higher education becoming increasingly cosmopolitan, disconnected, disengaged, particularly from local communities, the more objectified and disengaged you could be with sort of the higher status of the institution. And it represents in many ways what Gary talks about as a counterbalancing to a valuing of the local. And it's not that we don't value this cosmopolitan knowledge of the university, but we also value the local. And that includes local knowledge and local ways of knowing. So there's a counterbalancing going on when Carnegie puts out a classification like this, which is really important in the larger scheme. And then fundamentally, it's about our own work and why we do what we do and what's the purpose of our university. So this is your mission statement. So no matter where I went, I could pull up the mission statement, and it would actually say similar kinds of things, right? It would say certain things about engaging the public and preparing our students to lead productive, responsible, and satisfying lives. That's not unusual. You find that in a lot of different mission statements. Maybe a little unusual here in terms of a focus on the region and globally. There tends to be an emphasis to go globally and not so much go locally. Again, there's this rebalancing to the valuing of the local, and you can see that in your mission statement. Part about who you are as an institution. We'll talk more about that. For students to seek a better life for themselves and their fellow citizens. So there's sort of this civic component to it. Again, not unusual in mission statements. Okay. And then we'll be the strongest public university in the region and be known for our scholarship and diversity in service to our students and our community. So what does this actually mean in practice? What does it mean for the institution to, the way that I think about it is, how do you operationalize this mission? Right? So that it's more than just a document or more than rhetoric. And then part of what's going on with Carnegie is not only about operationalizing the mission of our institutions and claiming that as the identity, but it's also about change in higher education and what's going on in higher education, and not only nationally, but around the world. And it has to do with this question about how campuses claim a certain accountability. And the way that I think about this is accountability around improving the human condition. And it's here where these issues of community engagement and publicly engaged scholarship and community partnerships come right to the center of the conversation, which is exactly where they are now. This is not work that happens on the margins, which is in many ways the way it was seen 20 years ago, but it is core to the academic enterprise. And it's about redefining higher education for the 21st century. Now, you can think about this in a number of ways. You can think about this fundamentally as a way to reclaim the mission of the institution, reclaim the public purposes of higher education, and there are lots of national reports that begin to address this. This is just one that was issued in 2012 from the Association of American Colleges and Universities, A Crucial Moment, focusing on this question of college learning and democracy's promise, fundamentally around questions of civic learning and democratic engagement. Okay. So trying to revive the public purposes of higher education. And that's really important. But then there's this other question about why we do engagement. And here's where I often say, let's just sort of step aside from this whole engagement question. Because we could have come at this in a different way, and we could say, what's happening in our universities around generating knowledge? Because for many in the university, and faculty in particular, that is what they're there for. They're there to generate and disseminate new knowledge. Okay? And much of the work around engagement is fundamentally around this question of generating and disseminating new knowledge. And what does that look like in the 21st century university? So we could look at things like the National Science Foundation, and they have what now are called broader impact statements. So you can't submit a National Science Foundation grant without a broader impact statement. But what are they asking about? They're asking about what are the impacts of the science on the society? Right? How does this knowledge matter? And how will you demonstrate that? And when they talk about broader impacts, what they're really talking about is how does knowledge get generated, or what they talk about systems of knowledge. And how do we need to rethink those systems in much more, in the language here is around interactive ways. Okay? So how do we rethink systems of knowledge generation so that there are interactions between, in this case, scientists in the academy and those outside the academy to be able to actually create useful knowledge, right? Broader impacts. So this is not so much about engagement, but it's about generating knowledge that makes a difference. Okay? And it happens that engagement is a way to do that. NIH and CDC similarly are looking at these questions around community engagement as ways to think about generating knowledge that actually can have an impact, in this case on public health. Okay? All of this comes in a context too of ways in which we've been generating knowledge in the academy literally for centuries, which is that the expertise lies within the academy, and knowledge gets generated within that expertise and then gets applied externally. Right? And it's how we ended up with our categories after World War II of our basic and applied research. Basic research was this highly theoretical research done within the university that didn't have necessarily any particular application, and that's very valuable. And applied research was then that kind of research that could find some sort of application outside the university. And that too has value to it. But we're talking about something else here. We're not talking about purely basic or purely applied. We're talking about something closer to what was written about in a book called Pasteur's Quadrant, which is it's not purely basic and it's not purely applied, but it's actually use-inspired basic research. It has a purpose to it. It's use-inspired. And what we're learning out of this work, out of NSF and NIH and lots of other places, is that it comes out of collaboration. Knowledge generation comes out of collaboration between those outside the academy, where knowledge gets generated outside the academy, with the academy, where knowledge also gets generated. Okay? You see this playing out not only nationally but globally. And this is just one example. This is a conference coming up next month in Barcelona. Right? This is called the Global University Network for Innovation. Right? So what is this about? It's about engagement in ways that accept multiple sites and epistemologies of knowledge, as well as reciprocity and mutuality in learning and education through engagement. Right? How do we construct knowledge? Right? How do we do this in collaborative ways? Okay? What does a collaborative epistemology look like? Okay? So it's not about engagement, it's about the core work of the academy, which is generating and disseminating new knowledge. So they also talk about it in this way: how to build transformative knowledge to drive social change. Sounds like broader impacts. And the conference then will look at who the agents of knowledge creation are, how the creation, distribution, and use of knowledge are linked to our aspirations for a better world. Right? These are fundamentally deep epistemological questions about how we generate knowledge, how we construct knowledge, who's involved in that. Right? And fundamentally for us at the university, it means what are we going to count as legitimate knowledge in the university? We'll come back to that.
Folks, I really think I should go and get more data. Volunteer.
I'll go with you.
And then finally, in this work on the conference, you can see here how they frame this as one of the most significant trends in higher education in the past 10 to 15 years. And it's not so much that engagement is a trend, but the trend around how do we generate new knowledge. And how do we do that? We do it through engagement. So I use this often. This comes from a publication from the Association of Commonwealth Universities. Again, this is not just something happening nationally. This is a global movement. Right? And the statement here that the pursuit of knowledge demands engagement is a really powerful statement. In other words, it's not even a choice. If we want to generate new knowledge, we have to bring together knowledge inside the academy with knowledge that exists outside the academy, and the only way to do that is to engage. It demands engagement. The pursuit of knowledge demands engagement. It's not engagement for engagement's sake. And how to think about this new production of knowledge. And again, I also just want to emphasize that this isn't even so new anymore. This comes from a publication Michael Gibbons did in the early 90s, where he's talking about different modes of knowledge generation. And so this we know very well, this traditional academic knowledge generation. That looks very familiar. We're used to that. In fact, our universities were designed around that work. But this is what he's talking about as new forms of knowledge generation, what he calls engaged knowledge generation. The pursuit of knowledge demands engagement. We need to do it differently. So he uses the language of applied here. I would actually use the language of engaged. Problem-centered, transdisciplinary, heterogeneous, hybrid, demand-driven, entrepreneurial, network-embedded. It's a different way to think about how knowledge gets generated. And it has implications for how we organize the university. Fundamental in that is this notion of transdisciplinarity. So I would argue that one of the things that's core to this idea about how do we generate knowledge differently is that we do it in transdisciplinary ways. And I say that very specifically because I'm not talking about here multidisciplinary ways or cross-disciplinary ways or interdisciplinary ways. Because in all of those ways of thinking about generating knowledge, the knowledge is all within the academy. Right? We can bring together knowledge in this discipline with knowledge in this discipline. We can do that in interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary ways, but it doesn't reach outside the university. In a transdisciplinary way of thinking about knowledge generation, this knowledge is outside the university, this is within the university, and it brings together the two. The pursuit of knowledge demands engagement with those outside the academy. Right? So it is fundamentally transdisciplinary. That was one of the things in Michael Gibbons' list. Right? And then an aspect of being transdisciplinary is also to say, if you do transdisciplinary work, then you see the knowledge which is outside the academy and the knowledge producers outside the academy as assets to the process of knowledge production. And so part of this is a shift to asset-based education. And that has implications for our students and for our community partners and for knowledge generation. Okay? Because do we see our students as having assets that they bring into the classroom or only as having deficits? Do we see our community partners as having assets that they bring to a collaboration or only communities as a set of problems? Right? And do we see community partners as knowledge producers or simply consumers of the knowledge of the university? Okay? It's a fundamental shift in the way that we think about how we work. Right? And it is fundamental. You cannot do community engagement work unless you shift to transdisciplinary asset-based work. It's fundamentally different. I have been in conversations with community partners in the room and academics in the room talking about partnerships, and they talk right past each other. Right? And they don't even recognize that they're talking past each other because one of them is talking in a language of assets, the community partners, because they're used to asset-based community development work. And the academics are talking out of a deficit framework. Right? And they don't even know that they're talking a different language. It's a fundamental shift. Okay? So back to the Carnegie Classification then. So the Carnegie Classification you can think of as simply an artifact of this shift. Right? This larger shift around knowledge generation and what that means for engagement and what that means then, coming back to what are the implications for our institutions. Because we can do traditional knowledge generation within our institutions as they exist. And that raises the question, can we do engaged knowledge generation in our institutions as they exist? And I would suggest to you the answer is no. We need to change our institutions. So the classification then is partly around recognizing those changes. And again, fundamental to the classification is this notion of collaboration and reciprocity, and that does mean moving beyond this sort of expert model of knowledge generated in the university being applied externally. That is not what we mean about engagement, and it is a fundamental shift in the kind of work that we do. And I say that with real depth and sincerity because as a faculty member, and there are a number of faculty here in the room, we are trained academically and socialized in our disciplines to be the authority of knowledge, to be the expert. Okay? And therefore, to say that others have expertise and others have authority of knowledge is a really hard thing to break out of, because that's not what we were trained to do. Okay? So again, it requires this fundamental rethinking about the work that we do in the academy. And we then are very much part of this sort of socialization to be the experts that then can apply our knowledge externally. We also live in a world, particularly through land-grant institutions, where we have this deep history of extension, but extension too is caught up in that same kind of notion that the expertise is in the university and then we'll just apply it externally. Okay? Even though there are traditions within extension of doing much more collaborative work, for the most part that's been lost. Right? And we also know from a lot of this work that much of what happens is not very useful or effective. Right? And I see a lot of heads nodding, but we have decades of research on deep social problems that have had no impact whatsoever. Why is that? Why is it that I go to AERA, and I'm not picking on AERA, except it's sort of in my area, American Educational Research Association. And when you go to the conference, you pick up the program, and it's like a telephone book. Right? And you have to ask yourself, if we know this much about research and education, why are our schools in such disrepair? What's going on? Because the research isn't having an impact. Why not? Well, maybe it needs to be done differently.
I just wanted to ask you a quick question with regard to that. So is that the impetus for the change?
For
the
this?
lack of impact from the previous approach of teaching?
Yeah. I mean, it's reflected in the Carnegie, but it's much larger than that. It's in the NSF. We need knowledge which is going to make a difference. And we have too much evidence and history of knowledge that isn't making a difference. Yeah. You know, one way to think about that is think about what we know about poverty. Right? We have so much research about poverty and what causes poverty, right? And what poverty looks like. And yet we have increasing inequality and poverty. Right? So when are we going to have research that actually can start creating a difference? That's what we're beginning. That's what we need. It also is, I mean, I could go off on this in a number of different ways, but it also raises fundamentally the question of the future of the university. Because if the university in the 21st century, in the next 50 years, can't demonstrate that it actually has some relevance to society, you're going to see essentially the university become highly marginalized. And I even hesitate to say you're going to see, you already are seeing that happen. Right? And we're in this really deep transition period right now where higher education is fundamentally changing. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but if it doesn't become more relevant to the core issues of the society, it will be marginalized. And something else will come in to take its place. Right? We could talk about what that looks like too. All right, so often a question is asked, why do campuses seek a classification like the elective community engagement classification? There's lots of different reasons for this. This is just some of them that we know from campuses that have the classification. It's a way of doing institutional self-assessment and self-study, a way of doing program enhancement, quality enhancement. It's also a way of claiming legitimacy for the work. Campuses who have done this, like Cleveland State, for a long time, even though you have a short history, it's part of sort of who you are. It's a way of saying, well, this work is actually really legitimate work, and we should be doing this, and we could even do it better. There are also campuses that are using it, particularly public institutions, for purposes of accountability. This is a way that we demonstrate our accountability to the public. It's through our engagement work, and we can claim that. And there's a classification that allows us to do that. Other campuses use it as a catalyst for change. Okay? So maybe there's work on campus towards deeper engagement, but it's not quite there yet. So could we use the classification then to push this along? Right? Maybe we won't get the classification this time, but would the process push this work along? Could it be a catalyst for change? And then this notion of institutional identity. Who are we as an institution, and how can we claim that? So yeah, we're a research high institution, and we're really proud of that. But is that all that we are, or are we something else? Or if we're a community engaged campus, can we claim that as part of identity too? As part of who we are, and we want people to know who we are. We want students and parents to know who we are. We want legislators to know who we are. We want our partners to know that this is something that is critical to the institution. Right? So this core work around institutional identity. For all of these reasons and more, campuses claim this. Right? To be crude about it, the institutional identity part, it's not that terribly crude, but it's also about market niche. How do we distinguish ourselves from our competitors, right? And market ourselves in such a way that people know that this is what we stand for, right? And why would we necessarily even want to do that? Well, if you look at the data from, say, the HERI data, Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, it tells us now consistently over the past 25 years that more and more students coming out of college, coming out of high school, have had some sort of community service experience. Right now it's about 84%. Pretty much all of our students have had some sort of community service experience in their high school. And they're looking for it in college. So how would they know if they're going to find it here? They're looking at course catalogs, they're looking at websites. Is it apparent? Would they know? Are there campuses where they would know? If you were going to apply to Tulane University, you'd know immediately in everything that they put out on their website and everywhere else that you can do it there, and you can do it in the curriculum because it's required 2 courses if you're going to graduate. It is core to their work at the institution. They claim it as an identity. They have the classification, right? And so if they want to compete against other institutions, they say, if you are interested in doing this work as an undergraduate, come here. And 46,000 students applied there last year for 2,500 slots. Right? That didn't happen before Katrina. So there's something going on there, and we need to pay attention to it. And some campuses take this very seriously as a way of thinking about where they fit in the larger marketplace of higher education. All right, so in thinking about the classification, I would say think about 2 propositions. One is that engagement is achieved through institutional transformation, and the other is that multiple pathways to engagement are reflected in institutional engagement, and the classification captures all of those. So just briefly, here's what I mean by this. If you think about a study that was done by Ickel, Hill, and Green in 1998 on institutional transformation, they're asking the question here about how do campuses actually transform themselves, not just change, but change to be something quite different than what they were. Right? That's what they're looking at. And so they look at this question of transformational change is really culture change, and it has these different components to it. It's a change in the culture of the institution, and culture change is, we're talking about really deep, significant change here. And what I think about here is structures are actually easy. Culture is really hard. You may think structures are hard when you're trying to put in a new structure, but in the big scheme, they're relatively easy. So change in the culture of the institution, then this goes to the underlying assumptions and institutional behaviors, the processes, the products, it goes to the core of the culture. It's deep and pervasive, affecting the whole institution. It's intentional and it occurs over time. All of this is important because culture change takes a long time. It's not going to happen quickly, therefore you have to be intentional about it. There has to be this continuity in terms of keeping the effort moving. And this part about deep and pervasive is actually very helpful. So here's the model that they come up with. And if you think about this as you think about your Carnegie classification, I would argue it's actually really useful. So think about the classification as aiming for this quadrant. Right? That the work is both pervasive and deep. So your work around community engagement, and you could sort of do an assessment of this right now if you wanted to, just from where you sit at the institution. Is the work at Cleveland State University deep and pervasive? What would it mean if it were sort of just in quadrant 1? Well, you might have a few faculty sort of tinkering around with this. They maybe aren't very good at it, but they're trying to figure it out. So it's not very deep and it's not pervasive because they're in a few faculty in a couple of departments. But you could have faculty in 3 or 4 departments who have done this for a while, and they're doing it really well with incredible sort of quality and depth to it. So it's high depth, but it's only happening in a few places. It's not across the institution. Right? And then you can move into quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, and I would argue that the applications that come into Carnegie that get classified are somewhere in 3 moving to 4. I'd say there are actually very few in 4. They'd like to be in 4. They're mostly in 3 moving to 4. And if you're familiar with the application, it has 4 parts to it. There are foundational indicators that have 2 parts, and then there's curricular engagement and outreach and partnerships. I'll come back to that. And at the end of the foundational piece, It says if you haven't been able to provide sufficient evidence, don't go on. So that's also useful in thinking about the application because we don't see the applications in 1 and 2. They don't get to us because they don't have sufficient evidence to submit. And in 2010, half of the campuses that requested the application never turned it in. They were these campuses, so we don't see those. We only see these. Those are the ones that get submitted, and then some of those get classified. So as you think about your application, you want to just be thinking about where do we fit in this? And if this is the quadrant we're aiming for, what do we need to do to get there? And then the second proposition just comes from this idea, which is again from this Association of Commonwealth Universities. The Association of Commonwealth Universities, by the way, are those that used to be associated with the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. So New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, actually Great Britain, they're all part of this association. So here's this wonderful idea that engagement is a core value of the university. And that would mean as a core value, it has these different dimensions to it, or what they call here 4 spheres. Setting the university's aims, purposes, and priorities, relating teaching and learning to the wider world, the back and forth dialogue between researchers and practitioners, that's that epistemological piece we were just talking about, and taking on wider responsibility as neighbors and citizens. Right? So it has all of those dimensions to it. So you could think about it in this way, that the Carnegie Classification is asking for evidence in all of these 4 areas. And to be an engaged institution, you have to be doing all of these. So there has to be this sort of mission piece where we're actually aiming at fulfilling the mission of the institution. And that's part of what you'll find in the foundational indicators, questions about mission and strategic planning and leadership. Okay? But then it's also about connecting to the community through partnerships, right? And that's the outreach and partnership piece of it. And then there's the improved teaching and learning, think of the pedagogical piece. And that's the curricular engagement piece of the framework. And then there's this part, the new production of knowledge, the epistemological part. And that's the set of questions that are in the foundational indicators, again, foundational to this work, around is this work rewarded? Is it part of the faculty reward system? Right? Is it part of the criteria for how faculty are rewarded? And that we know means not only in their teaching and learning and their service, but in their scholarship, right? In the production of knowledge. Right? So all of these pieces are going to have to be part of what it means to be an engaged institution. We could do any one of these pieces well and not be an engaged institution. But to be an engaged institution, we would do all of them. And again, the classification is aimed at capturing those. You can imagine that this is not easy. It's not easy on any campus. It's not easy on my campus. It's probably not easy on your campus. Because you're talking about fundamentally changing the way that we do our work. Right? It's part of the redefinition of higher education in the 21st century. So there are areas that campuses are challenged by, and these are just some of them that come out of the applications. There's a really difficult piece about assessing the community's perceptions around this, right? How do we know what the community thinks about this? How do we know what kind of impact this is having? Right? So we need to do more in terms of that assessment piece. We need to know also about how this is impacting faculty on the campus. And again, we're not seeing a lot of good data around that in the applications. A lot more needs to be thought about in terms of the community's role in creating the institution's plans for engagement. And I would even, in some ways, take that a step further. Let me just give you an example. On our campus, I've been involved in now 2 strategic planning processes, neither of which I would say were either strategic or planful. And I don't think that's actually unusual. But in the last one we did, it was striking to me. Now, let me just give you a little context here. I sit at a public urban research university right in the city of Boston, right, with a deep, what we call urban mission, although it's not exactly clear what that means. Okay. And in our strategic planning process, we did what many campuses do. which is to look at institutional data, reams of institutional data, right? To figure out what sense we can make out of it, to figure out where we were going. It might have been really helpful, given that we have the Boston Foundation right in Boston, that every other year creates what are called the Boston Indicators, all of this data about the neighborhoods of Boston, that we might have looked at some of that data alongside of our institutional data. Because if we really were serious about the community that we're a part of, we might have wanted to look at what that data meant for our institution. And we didn't. We didn't even consider it. Right? So if we were serious about it, we might then in our strategic planning not only look at institutional data, but look at community data as well. And then come up with a real strategic plan for an urban public research university. So anyway, you can see here where there are other challenges as well. In 2010, the letter that went out to campuses said, here's 4 areas that you need to continue to pay attention to, even as a classified institution. One was around assessment. And if you look at the documentation framework or the application, it says systematic assessment. In other words, assessment is something that you gather data about all the time. And what happens with the Carnegie, we know from the applications and talking to campuses, is that data is collected for the Carnegie. That's not systematic. Right? To scramble around to figure out how to answer all the questions in Carnegie to get the classification is not systematic assessment. Okay? So there's this problem with assessment. And assessment is a difficult problem on a number of different levels at our institution. Reciprocal partnerships is still a really hard piece. In terms of a collaborative reciprocal relations with partners, instead of placing students in the community, having sites where students will go to, where we do research which we involve but we don't collaborate with community partners, and on and on. Again, going back to that expert model of applied work. Faculty rewards is still a challenge. Right? Campuses are not, in large part, have not reached the point where they've changed their promotion and tenure guidelines to specifically articulate values around community engagement. And as I think about this, I always think that if it's not incentivized, then in fact there are disincentives to doing it. It's not enough to say, well, faculty can do this despite what our guidelines say. Okay? So there's work that needs to be done around that. And then this last part is the integration and alignment with other institutional initiatives. So what the foundation means by that is that if community engagement is an institutional priority, then is it aligned with other institutional priorities at the institution? So what do I mean by that? Let's go back to the model again. So here's that model of deep and pervasive. And when we were at Tennessee State University talking about this in exactly the same kind of conversation, the president of the university, Melvin Johnson, was in the room. And he was paying attention to what we were talking about. And then at one point he was looking perplexed and he raised his hand and he said, something's missing. Right? It's not just a matter of being deep and pervasive. There's something missing. He said, it has to be deep and it has to be pervasive, but it also has to be integrated. And that's where real change takes place. Otherwise, it's really not going to affect the institution. So what did he mean by that? What he meant was that, yeah, it has to be deep and pervasive. That's absolutely essential. But if it's not integrated with other institutional priorities, it's really not going to have an effect. Like what? Well, like diversity and inclusion. We have that as an institutional priority at many of our institutions, but is the community engagement work connected to that? And if it's not, then are we going to really see the changes that we're looking for? Now, what does that mean to connect those two? Well, we have actually a lot of data now that students who we might think of as underserved students, students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, first-generation students, do much better academically through what George Q calls high-impact practices And some of those high impact practices, the most effective ones, are those that engage students in community, things like service learning. And his data shows that the impact is greater for underserved students than the student body as a whole. So we could connect then, we could integrate the community engagement work with our diversity and inclusion work. The diversity and inclusion work isn't only about students, but it's also about faculty, because just as the demographics is changing for our student body, it's also changing for our faculty. More slowly, but it's still changing. And we've got data now going back to the 90s. Think of Anthony Antonio's work, where he was looking at faculty of color and raising questions about their research interests. And his data showed that the faculty of color had deep research interest in issues in the community. So they were really interested in doing this work in the community, and then were walking into institutions that didn't value that work. That leads to all sorts of other implications about recruitment and retention of faculty. There's also data to show that those same faculty are the ones that are more likely to use high impact practices, more engaged, active, and collaborative learning practices in the classroom, which then has an impact on the students' success. So is this work then integrated with other institutional priorities like the retention and success of our students? And if it's not, then it's really not going to make the kind of change. That's what Melvin Johnson is getting at. Deep, pervasive, and integrated. We need to begin to think about how we bring these institutional priorities together, because they aren't separate. They are very much connected to one another. So that's the integrated piece. Now, another way to think about the Carnegie, go ahead.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Well, Shawnee's, can I?
Oh, yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you, John, why don't you finish, because we're going to have a period of
Okay.
questions and dialogue. So if you sort of
I'll
wrap
table.
up.
Yeah. All right. As you can see, I could probably do this for the next 3 or 4 hours. All right, I'm going to just stop here, and then we'll stop. So if you look at the Carnegie data and try to make sense out of it, who has the classification? There's 311 campuses now that have the classification from 3 rounds of the classifications. Right? How do you make sense out of it? And we've tried to disaggregate this in all sorts of ways, by size, by Carnegie basic classification, by residential, non-residential, all sorts of ways. Right? And we couldn't come up with anything that worked. But then we looked at this one category, which is being an ASCU campus. What's an ASCU campus? American Association of State Colleges and Universities, the public state colleges and universities. And consistently, over the 3 years, a third of the campuses get the classification. Or a third of the classified campuses are ASCU campuses. You can't say that about any other way to slice the data. So what's going on? Well, one thing about ASCU campuses, and by the way, Cleveland State is an ASCU campus, a very typical ASCU campus, is that they have this characteristic of being a steward of place. What does it mean to be a steward of place? Well, if you talk to someone at an ASCU campus, they'll say things like, it is our responsibility to prepare the future citizens and civic leaders of our community. That's what we do. That's what it means to be a steward of place. It also means that the institution is fundamental to the locality and region that it's in. It would be devastating if the campus left, right? For all sorts of civic and economic and other reasons. Right? That's sort of a good way to think about who you are. Another part about being a steward of place, which is different than what David Moras was talking about when he was talking about anchor institutions, because you are also an anchor institution, you're core to this community, you're not going anywhere. Corporations, they come and go, but you're staying, right? You're an anchor. Many anchor institutions are not stewards of place in the sense that at a Cleveland State University, the students that come here for the most part will go back into the locality and region. Other anchor institutions, which really claim an identity and are wonderful as anchor institutions, think of places like University of Pennsylvania, right? or Syracuse University. They claim this identity as an anchor institution. The students that go there don't come from the local community, and they don't go back to the local community. That's what's different about being a steward of place. So that's part of the way to think about what this means for a place like Cleveland State University. Right? What does it mean to be, and enact, operationalize a steward of place? And you'll see everything we're not going to talk about. All right, and then back to the question. But anyway, I'll leave it.
No, so I want to do, because I can sense we really want to dive in, and I can imagine some of those slides we want to get to.
Okay.
So I don't want to do that. So I want to, usually we've had, and everybody I think in the room has done this, we've had conversations at the table. But because I think there's real back and forth here that's of value, let me just do this very quickly. I'm going to ask Jessica to capture this. Just very quickly, just around the room, just to check in with you. So rather than ask a question, what right now are highlights of what folks in the room may be thinking especially those of you who have been listening throughout this, this notion of the institution's transformation. I think it's very interesting. Up till now, a lot of the conversation is the impact externally. And what you've been pointing us to is, well, what is the transformation institutionally, internally? And so just to capture a handful of thoughts that may be emerging very briefly. Anybody who, yes?
Absolutely, engagement as a core value. When you talk about engagement as a core value in the university, and I kind of going back to the Johnson model of integration, I'm particularly interested in how we develop, promote, and then assess engagement as a core value of our departments, because that's who we are as an institution, particularly at the level of faculty, but at the level of department, not administration.
Mm-hmm.
Thank goodness we have Dr. White, but departments, faculty, tenured faculty, herding cats. we know that analogy. How do we then bring ourselves together as faculty in departments to contribute to engagement as a core value for the university as a whole? I think that's a huge problem here at Cleveland.
So John, hang on to that assessment at the department, faculty-driven level. Any other thoughts top of mind that have emerged? Go ahead.
Jack, I have a question, but I'm not going to ask it. But top thoughts that are top of mind from this presentation would be with regard to a huge amount of work with regard to culture change within an institution to be able to shift the thinking to this approach. Almost a bit overwhelming, mm-hmm. but sounds worth it. Sounds like it's worth it, because I was looking for the correlation, because we talked about impact in the community, and I'm from a community college, and what our focus in, you talk about the fact that everyone's shifting their thought process with focusing on outcomes. So are the legislators, and they want to know, how are we getting students in? And being that that's the focus of our work right now, I wanted to hear how community engagement, I know there's tons of data that supports student outcomes, and I wanted to hear that out of your mouth, and you said that, but so a lot of things affect retention, mm-hmm. a lot of things affect student outcomes, but why is this one so important?
So is that that's the question you were, okay. So good, so that connection to outcomes, particularly the ones we're having to pay attention to right now, mm-hmm. completion and retention. Dr. Pratt?
The word that sticks out for me is reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about what that looks like and how you actually execute, because the culture change is really bigger than the institution. If there's going to be reciprocity with the community, there's going to have to be cultural change in the community as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that reciprocity might be an instrument that helps that to occur. I just don't know how that happens. I don't know what that looks like. So I'm really curious to know more about that.
That's good. That's good. Well, Dan, let's get.
One of the things that struck me, John, that is sort of an economics argument or behavioral change argument, that if you're not incentivizing it, you may as well be disincentivizing it, because there are all of these competing incentives for tenure, for publishing for tenure, for whatever. So it does, and that can only come through structural, institutional change. It can be a catalyst for more change, but it can also only come from the institution. It can't happen at the individual faculty level.
Yeah, it's good.
That means you have work to do.
Yes, well, not alone though. Dr. Jones.
Yes, I have, I guess, two sort of interrelated questions. One is regarding cultural change and where that emanates from within the hierarchy or structure of an organization. Top down, bottom up, somewhere in the middle. What kind of processes do you utilize to pursue that cultural change? And then the other question kind of relates to timing and what might be going on at a university at any given point in time that might facilitate sort of the transformation and cultural change. For example, as you may know, we're undergoing this 43 conversion process, which is somewhat major in terms of the time commitments and the demands that it's putting on certain people. Would this be a good time to try to incorporate or integrate the notion of engagement, or should it be kind of pursued separately or in a parallel way? How do you integrate all those things to be? Is this an opportunity or a bad time? I guess would be the
So
question.
John, why don't you answer everyone in a minute? But come back up, and I think your big picture, a lot around this culture change, from where it emanates, how it connects to big initiatives, how it is embedded on the ground, how you make those connections institutionally, but then a little bit also about outcomes, relevant institutional outcomes, and then this notion of reciprocity, the role of community. I mean, sort of captures, and if it takes us back to some of the slides we made, that's fine.
All right, so the first thing I would say is that to engage in this process of transformation, you have to start with these conversations. Right? So this is exactly the kind of thing that needs to happen. You need to put the really hard things out on the table and begin to grapple with them, because everything that you just talked about is one of these really hard things, right? So starting with the departments, you're absolutely right. If this isn't owned by the departments, which is where faculty culture lives, it's not going anywhere, right? So it's got to be driven to the departmental level.
Jeff, you can move the mic a little.
Oh, yeah. So how does that happen? Well, it can happen at different places differently. I can give you some examples, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen that way here. So a place like University of North Carolina at Greensboro, from my experience, they are probably one of the best examples right now of actually being able to look at what do department level guidelines and criteria actually look like. Because in 2008, they revised their campus-wide guidelines to specifically articulate rewards for community engagement in teaching, in research, and in service, right? And to set a criteria. But then the next part was a charge to all of the departments to come up with their own, and essentially take the institutional-wide criteria and translate it down to the department level. So that was 2008. I would say, I've seen some of these. I'm guessing maybe there's somewhere between 6 and a dozen campus departments that have pulled it off. So it's hard. It's really hard. But it also begins to provide us with some really good examples, right? So that's one place to look. The other part is to just think about what's being driven out of your discipline. Because in many disciplines, the same thing that we're talking about at the institutional level is happening at the disciplinary level. Right? Questions about a different way to think about knowledge in the discipline so that it actually has an impact on the society. Right? So what's happening in your discipline? You could ask that in all of yours. And I always fundamentally start with the question of what's the public relevance of your discipline? And if you can begin to grapple with that, you can begin to work your way into then how do we approach that?
I need to say, and for some it's particularly challenging because I am in a discipline, English literature, that does not want to make itself accessible to the public. It would be fine with us if we then remained in the old school for those people who are truly interested in deep structure, archival research, and knowledge for a few.
Right.
So it's, and I'm not taking away from that, but I really do appreciate that because I teach African American literature. I do what you're talking about just in
right.
light of my discipline.
Right.
At the same time, because I'm not focused on publishing literary scholarship, but doing more community-based local work, that's not, I don't quite know where I fit in. So I thank you, because that is a good point of departure for me in terms of making this assessment and engagement as a core value, not something that we offer or embrace rhetorically, but in reality as well.
Right.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can segue that into a couple of different places. And I am going to go find a slide here. So in thinking about kind of creating a culture of engagement on the campus, and this goes in part to what you were talking about, but it is intended to partly take us to a different conversation. To get at this question of policies, there needs to be a number of things in place, right? So one is that there needs to be a clear understanding of what it is we're talking about. And so what often happens when you have this conversation and you open it up is that there's not a really clear understanding of what we mean by engagement, right? And that has also disciplinary implications, right? Like a historian that came up to me at the Organization of American Historians where I was talking about community engagement, and she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, well, think about a public intellectual. And she said, oh, I get that. I mean, it's like, okay, so, right, how do you frame this in disciplinary ways? But what is it we're talking about? And then there's the question of the institutional policies. And let me just give you an example of what I mean. I think I have it here. So here's Syracuse University. Syracuse University revised its promotion and tenure guidelines in, I think it was 2010, right? Not that long ago. This is a private research, very high university. Has changed its promotion and tenure guidelines to specifically articulate community, or what they call publicly engaged scholarship. So this is a really, I like this a lot for a number of reasons, right? So just look at the way this is constructed. Syracuse is committed to long-standing traditions of scholarship, right? So in other words, we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. We recognize these traditions are really important. We value those, right? And we're going to continue to value those, as well as evolving perspectives on scholarship, right? But we recognize things are changing. Syracuse recognizes the role of academia is not static, and that methodologies, how we go about generating knowledge, topics of interest, and boundaries with and between disciplines change over time. The university will continue to support scholars in all of these traditions, including faculty who choose to participate in publicly engaged scholarship. Right? So this is a really important way to frame this. So it's not an either or, it's not either you do this or you do that, but it says we make space at the university for those who choose to do publicly engaged scholarship, and we value that.
Excuse me, so that's actually in the university's tenure
And promotion guidelines. You can pull it up online.
Okay.
Yep. Publicly engaged scholarship, now it says, what do we mean by it? May involve partnership of university knowledge and resources with those of the public and private sectors to enrich scholarship, research, and creativity and public knowledge, enhance curriculum teaching and learning, prepare educated, engaged citizens, strengthen democratic values and civic responsibility, address and help solve critical social problems, and contribute to the public good. Right? So it's not only about what it is, but why are we doing this? Why would Syracuse University do this? And again, I want to go back to it's about making space. Okay? Not about saying, we all got to do this, right? Or not about the faculty member who once raised his hand when I was talking about this and said, this is really scary. And I said, well, why is this so scary? He said, well, because it's threatening. He said, I'm a bench scientist. He said, the more you value this, the less you're going to value what I do. And it's not an either or. You got to get out of that. It's not about either this or that. It's about making space so that those who do publicly engaged scholarship are valued for the work that they're doing. It's legitimized at the university, right? So that's why this kind of construction is helpful. Okay, some questions, go ahead.
How long did it take Syracuse to get to that point from when they first began conversations like these?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and you can answer that in probably a few different ways. On one end of the spectrum, you would say, and this would be the chancellor's point of view, it took about 4 years, and she was really frustrated that it took that long. From another point of view, as a colleague of mine, Gene Rice, who spent years in Washington at AAHE, he looks at this and he said, oh, this work started about 25 years ago. He said when Robert Diamond was on campus and he was helping them think about what kind of scholarship should we be doing, how do we rethink research, and that was like 3 or 4 chancellors ago. So I would argue this has probably been building for a long time, and it kind of reached a point with different leadership where it came to a head. I don't know. It probably depends on where you sit, how you would answer that question. So, yeah.
That was my question. But added on to that, the other part of it is, and I don't know if you know this, but the process of getting there, I mean, kudos to them for getting there, but was the process that got them there collaborative? Or sometimes these processes happen in a lot of different
Okay, so
ways.
I want to segue that to the other question. So top down, bottom up, right? So at Syracuse, it was passed through the faculty council with a lot of support from senior faculty. It was collaborative. It was not without contention, okay? And I would say that for some faculty, and again, I don't know the ins and outs of Syracuse, but I would say for some faculty, they perceive this as very top-down. So, but let me shift that a little bit to a study that we did. We did a study of the 2006 Carnegie campuses to try to make sense out of who got classified, what we could learn from it. And there were a group of 7 campuses that we really thought were in sort of that 4th quadrant. They had changed their promotion and tenure guidelines. They sort of have all the institutional pieces in place. And so we were trying to figure out what was going on at those campuses. So then we did a set of interviews with academic leaders on those campuses. And we found something that we weren't looking for. This was actually, we didn't see this coming at all. But what we got back from the data was that there was, on all of these campuses, both a top-down and bottom-up approach going on at the same time. There was grassroots work on the part of faculty, and there was very strong leadership driving it. In fact, there were strong leaders at the top at some of these institutions who saw their leadership role at the top to facilitate grassroots work by the faculty from the bottom up. That's how they saw their role. So it was very interesting. Now, what came out of that, which we didn't anticipate, was the role of the deans. And it became really clear that the deans were the gatekeepers. In other words, it's where the top-down and the bottom-up meets. So where deans were supportive, this work just went ahead with gangbusters. But deans could also be the block to it. They could stop it dead in its tracks. And that even came back to deans of certain colleges. So it was never the dean of the College of Education, because the dean of the College of Education has very little power on campuses. I can tell you that from my own college. Right? The most powerful deans were the ones that had the most money and the most students. So either the College, in some cases, of Science and Math, or the College of Liberal Arts, often the one with the most students. And so those key deans became the key gatekeepers to whether or not this stuff unfolded or not. So what does that tell us? It means as we think about this strategically, we know that those deans are going to be critical to the success of this work on the campus. And the other thing to keep in mind with all of that is that top down, bottom up, everybody's looking over their shoulders. The faculty are looking over their shoulders to see what their chairs think. The chairs are looking over their shoulders to see what the deans think. The deans are looking over their shoulders to see what the provost thinks. And the provost claims that he's looking over his shoulder because he won't do anything unless the deans are on board, and the deans won't do anything unless the chair. So everybody's looking at everybody else, right? So top down, bottom up, everybody's got to get in this game together, or else it's not going to work, right? Because signals get sent all over the place. That's how culture works. All right, and I want to take that back to a question that came from over here. I think the person left though. And that was this question about the change to a 4 credit to 3 credit, and was this an opportunity or a challenge? Or you can approach that in a whole bunch of different ways. But one way that I would think about that is that core to this work around community engagement, from a faculty perspective, is that it provides the opportunity for integrated faculty roles in ways that other work just doesn't. And what do I mean by that? Faculty who do community engagement work will talk about in great detail that they don't separate out the categories of teaching and research and service, that they are all integrated as one. In fact, I read promotion and tenure files all the time where this starts out by saying, I can't divide my work into these 3 categories, because the work that I do around teaching and learning is community-based. It's fundamentally tied to the research I do in the community, and it's fundamentally tied to the service work that I do in the community. I can't separate these out. That's really important in terms of thinking about faculty workload, because one of the things that makes faculty work so difficult, particularly in institutions where research requirements are being ramped up, is that it's really hard to be excellent in research when that's over here, and be really good in teaching when that's over here, and be really good in terms of a service contribution if that's over there, and they're very separate activities. You gotta be excellent all over the place, and it's killing people, right? Surveys of faculty, young faculty coming up through the ranks, show a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly among women faculty, that they don't want this rat race, they don't want this divided sense of their lives, they don't want it, right? And yet, the faculty who do community engagement work are often women, often faculty of color, right? Often what we think of unrepresented faculty on our campuses, and they do it because it integrates their lives instead of separating them out. So maybe this is an opportunity then, right? As faculty feel like more and more and more is put upon them, then engagement isn't one more thing put upon them, but a way to do their work differently. Right? So that it allows for this kind of integration where it's not about having to do these different areas of work, but doing one area of work and doing it really well. So that's just one way to think about that.
The reciprocity questions.
Okay.
Continue to connect.
Yeah. So here's how I think about that. I did this piece with a few colleagues a few years ago, which we called the Democratic Engagement White Paper. We were trying to look at these questions about reciprocity and collaboration. I could tell you a lot of stories about that, but one of the stories was that when we put this out, and we just did it virtually, it went out on the ether, we got responses from all over the globe, literally. But we also got responses from outside of the academy. So I got this really interesting response from the director of an arts organization, and he said, everything you're talking about in higher education explains exactly what's happened in the arts in the last 20 years. Okay? So he said, you know, the kinds of changes you're talking about are also changes that need to take place in the arts. We need to sort of reclaim our public purpose, get back to community engagement, rethink about funding sources, the importance of public art, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't write it for that purpose. And then he said, and you could apply this to other sectors as well. You could apply it to social services and social work. You could apply it a lot of different ways. So it's not just about higher education. So you're right, it's happening all over the place. And so it probably requires changes in other parts too. Right? I do think, though, that we can play a role in the work that we do around community engagement in terms of building the capacity of our community partners to be able to do the kind of collaborative work that we're talking about, and that they are very open to that, but don't necessarily have the resources and capacity building resources that they need to be able to do it. So that's just one way to think about it. And where community partners really are brought in as real collaborators in the process is where I hear them say things like, I mean, I love community partners. So here's just a few of my sort of favorite quotes. Community partners who say, I really want to be a co-educator. Right? Now what is that? That's amazing. What does it mean to be a co-educator? Right? Or a community partner who says, we need, this, I love this one, we need less evidence-based practice, right? Because that's the standard in government funding for science, evidence-based practice. So we need less evidence-based practice and more practice-based evidence. That's brilliant. Talk about an epistemological shift, right? Or recently a community partner said to me, as the university rises, the community needs to rise as well. Right? And I think really that's sort of what we're talking about here. Right? Community partners are amazing knowledge sources. Right? We just need to get them into the conversation. Right? So none of this is easy. Nobody ever said it was easy. It's like Ira Harkavy says, this isn't rocket science. It's much harder than that. Yeah.
I wanted to comment on something that you said earlier about linking this kind of work to the work of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I think there's something else that needs to be part of the discussion too, and this is just my opinion, that inclusion is not the same as assimilation.
Yeah.
And in my mind, but for too long, I think it has been equated with assimilation. We'll let you in, we'll accept you as you are, but you can't stay that way. Now, at the end of this process of engagement, you need to be the mirror image of the others in the academy. So whenever I think we're able to strike a balance between what we say about diversity and inclusion and then collaborating with those community partners, then I think these things will begin to work in an excellent way.
Yeah.
Right now it's very stressful for me.
Yeah, and I also think, from my perspective, it comes back to this question of we really need to rethink the institution. Right? I mean, this is really about the organization that we live within, and how do we rethink that organization. I don't know if you're familiar with Roberto Ibarra's work. Roberto did this wonderful book called Beyond Affirmative Action. It's a terrible title for a wonderful book. So there's a metaphor that he uses in the book. He said, in one way that we've approached diversity and inclusion, we've said, here's the front door, you're welcome in. Okay? And that was sort of one approach. And then he said another approach was that we said, you can come on and you can have this room over here. Okay? And that's another, and it goes to sort of what you're saying. But then he said another way to think about it is that let's build this house together. And we'll just rebuild the house and see what we come up with together as a different way of thinking about what does it mean to really focus on diversity and inclusion. I think that's more what we're talking about here, but it goes back to that question of organization and transformation. Yeah.
I was just going to say that was a very valid, what you just said made perfect sense with regard to the distinction between assimilating and including, but that just really underscores how the way of thinking from the university is so embedded, you know what I mean, in their mind. They would want them to assimilate as opposed to just embracing them for who they are and changing the thinking. But I just wanted to ask you a quick question. Is there a deliberate approach for educators to be trained up in this way of thinking?
All right, so great question. So one of the problems, you could look at it this way, is that we need to do something to change the pipeline. Right? Because otherwise we're just going to simply continue to socialize early career academics into exactly the same systems again, and then reproduce them, and then be exactly where we are now, trying to figure out how to get them out of it. Right? But again, what's happening in graduate education are shifts which say that we're paying more attention to this kind of community engaged work as part of the graduate training and socialization of what will become future academics. And I could, again, point a lot of places here. So there's an organization called Imagining America around public engagement in the arts, humanities, and design, and they have this incredibly robust group of graduate students called PAGE, the PAGE Program, Publicly Active Graduate Education. There's an organization called the International Association for Research on Service Learning and Community Engagement, and they have this incredibly strong graduate student network. There's the engagement, they changed their name, but they used to be the National Outreach Scholarship Conference. What are they now? The Engagement
Consortium.
Something. Community Engagement.
Engaged Scholarship Consortium.
Yeah, okay. And for years now, they've had as part of their conference the Emerging Engaged Scholars Workshop. Right? And then there are all these other networks you find of these engaged graduate students online. And then you have campuses like Michigan State University that offers a graduate certificate in community engagement. So graduate students in any graduate program can get their degree and they can get the certificate in community engagement. And the argument there is that this is partly to make them more marketable. Because as a community engaged scholar, you bring a whole bunch of resources in terms of being a better teacher and a different kind of researcher. And we would expect, and there's a question in the Carnegie about this, around recruitment and hiring. So are we doing anything in our hiring to actually attract engaged scholars to our institution? So this is part of a larger system, right? And yeah, there's changes taking place. I would argue that what we're seeing change in graduate school is because of what we talked about, Rich, earlier, about changes in the way that we think about generating knowledge. I think about my own campus, right? So I teach in a higher education administration program, and I have colleagues in my program and in public policy and do ed policy, and for years we've taught qualitative and quantitative research methods, right? For the first time, we're teaching participatory action research. Okay? So why? Well, one is that we have a lot of students who really want to do participatory action research projects, and we weren't teaching them how to do it, right? And the other is, why not teach that as a methodology? If we're going to teach, right, qualitative and quantitative research methods, why not teach collaborative research methods? Okay? And again, I think you're seeing a lot more of that going on as well. So hopefully that'll shift the pipeline, which means that the faculty that we hire, and I can tell you a lot of the faculty we hire want to do this work. And unless we change as an institution, it's going to be to our detriment. And I'll just leave with one more anecdote, because I know we're probably out of time and I'm probably out of anecdotes. But we did a search on my campus, and again, you know the context of my campus. This is about 3 years ago. A woman of color in the search committee meeting asked exactly the right question. She says, I do participatory action research. Is that valued at this campus? Right? And we're a campus that says we want more diversity in faculty, we really value, right? She didn't come to our campus. The answer was really complicated, right? Now, maybe she didn't come for other reasons, but it certainly didn't encourage her to come to the campus. Right? So then I told that story at another campus, and afterwards, this woman came up afterwards in tears. And she said to me, I asked that question when I was hired here. And they said it was, and it's not. If we want those faculty to come to our campuses and to thrive at our campuses, we're going to need to change. Because either they won't come into the academy or they'll go somewhere else. And if we really want to attract the best faculty, we're going to have to take this engagement work seriously. So I'll leave it then.
So I want to just throw out two very quick things, and this will be what you will get in follow-up emails. So we have 2 sets of work to do as a result of this series, and we can think of it as bottom-up, top-down, perhaps. One is we have this rich experience that many of you have gone through at one level or another and contributed to, and we've had, folks like John and others contribute their time and thinking. And so the first question is, how do we maximize that asset? We will certainly be capturing what's been spoken among us. We have great video, we have slides, And the question then becomes, how do we share with the broader audiences and constituents and peers so that we are instigating the kind of dialogue you've talked about and encouraging the kind of efforts at all levels, including on the ground, that begin to move these things forward in an organic way even. I mean, we can strategize forever, but how do we just get more folks to begin thinking, and how does that fuel the dialogues and networks you're in? One thing to think about. The second is, how do we make sense of what we've learned in a way that in some collective way we are able to sort of express broadly, here's what we're thinking about what we ought to be, how we ought to be moving forward, and particularly at Cleveland State, given what we've learned, where we are right now, and what does that look like? So it's sort of two different questions. So one, I'm just going to encourage you, since you're here, to send a note, an email, a thought as you think about this on how that is. We have, whether it's the Civic Commons tools and other tools to instigate both of those things, how might we expand the dialogue and do some sense making? I know that one thing we will do at some level is convene people who have been participating, sitting in, to do some of that sense making work, and we'll figure out the best way to do that that's efficient and constructive, but we will do some of that. So this doesn't end here. We'll continue the work, and most importantly, I hope that you all find ways in your work with colleagues and the things you're doing here on campus, or our friends right down the street or down the highway, to use this in your efforts in many different ways. So thank you again, and John, we really appreciate your time and the things you've shared with us.